Hey everyone, let's start tonight with one of the best things about being human, coming up with more and more creative ways to hurt each other when talking doesn't work anymore. Before you get too comfortable, please like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. No stress. I'm not here to attack your village or take your firewood. And please tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from. In every part of the world, it wasn't a noble fight of honor, bravery, and respect for each other in medieval times. That idea mostly came about because people who weren't there needed something to believe in that would make them feel better. In reality, medieval warfare was a design problem that kept getting worse, like an arms race run by people who had never heard the phrase, "Maybe this is enough." Every battle asked the same question: how do we make sure the other person doesn't exist anymore? Before would be best. Lunch. At first, swords worked well. Then came armor, a lot of armor. Every year, more armor. Knights kept adding metal plates, as if they were afraid the enemy would try to hug them too hard. Soon, warriors looked like pots and pans, loud, sure of themselves, and getting harder to deal with. The only way weapon makers knew how to respond was by making weapons. Panic and creativity mixed. If cutting didn't work, they crushed. If crushing didn't work, they stabbed. If puncturing didn't work, they hooked, pulled, tripped, or just pushed the other person over and let gravity finish the talk. Engineers in the Middle Ages didn't believe in elegant solutions. They thought it worked or not. And what's impressive, or very worrying, is how quickly new ideas came up. Someone would come to the battlefield wearing thicker armor, and in just a few years, everyone else would have a brand new weapon that was made just for that armor to make it feel like a bad investment. No refunds and no warranty. Blacksmiths tried out different things all the time. They put spikes on because they could. They put chains on because being rigid didn't work for them emotionally. They made the handles longer so that soldiers could stay emotionally safe from the screaming. Every design choice screamed, "I learned this the hard way." This kind of creativity wasn't just for professionals. Farmers changed their tools. Hunters used their gear in new ways. Last week, the militia showed up with things that were technically doing other jobs. It was able to transfer force and make people feel bad. Turned into a weapon right away. The battlefield became a place to try out bad ideas that worked way too well. Once an idea worked, it spread quickly. There were no ethics committees, no safety testing, and no time to think things through. All you could do was survive and hope that what you built wouldn't come back to get you. Warfare in the Middle Ages wasn't poetic. It wasn't a love story. It was iterative design under a lot of stress. And every scary, weird weapon you're about to see is. When people are cold, scared, and armored like refrigerators, they have to be creative. When medieval weapon makers saw a perfectly normal stick and thought, "This is way too safe," they made the flail. At its core, the flail is very simple: a handle, a chain, and a ball with spikes on the end. In real life, It's a lot of uncontrolled chaos, physics with anger problems, and a complete lack of concern for safety. The idea behind the flail was actually smart. Shields were becoming an issue. The armor was getting thicker. Weapons that were straight bounced. Someone asked the most medieval question ever. What if the weapon kept going after it hit something? Come in the chain, the flail could swing around shields over armor and sometimes hit the person using it in the face. There are risks that come with innovation. The flail, on the other hand, didn't care about being elegant. There was no graceful fencing, no careful timing, and no polite exchange of blows. You swung it, and the battlefield figured out the rest. The chain took in energy, changed the direction of force, and made every move a surprise. Even fighters who had been in a lot of fights didn't always know where the spiked head would land. This made enemies nervous and allies very aware. The flail's best feature was its mental power. It wasn't just dangerous to face a flail, it was also stressful. Shields stopped working, armor didn't feel as safe. Every swing was like an uninvited guest who knew your schedule and could sneak past your defenses. The sound alone, metal, the sound of chains rattling and snapping through the air was enough to make hearts race before anyone even touched them. Of course, the flail had one small flaw. It was just as risky for the user. Bad idea to have tight formations. Worse idea, small spaces, too much swinging. You did it. You found recoil the old-fashioned way. Many injuries that happened on the battlefield were probably caused by misunderstandings between the weapon and its owner. That's why flails were never used by everyone. They needed space, strength, and the accepting that the weapon sometimes made its own choices. Not every soldier wanted to risk their life on something that acted like it didn't want to be held. The flail, on the other hand, is a great example of medieval creativity. It wasn't polished, it wasn't safe, but it did fix a problem. Shields didn't work as well anymore. Armor didn't make me feel as safe. And more chaos was added to a place that was already chaotic. The flail wasn't meant to be perfect. It was made to be hard to predict. And in the Middle Ages, being unpredictable could sometimes be the most dangerous thing of all. At some point in the Middle Ages, weapon makers stopped being subtle. Swords weren't working anymore. Armor had become so good that when someone tried to slice through it, all that happened was a loud clang and an awkward pause while both fighters thought about their lives. So, the mace came to be. A weapon that asked a very simple question. What if we stopped trying to get through the armor and just punish the person who is in it? The mace didn't care if the edges were sharp or the technique was fancy. It was blunt force trauma with no doubt. A strong handle with a heavy head, usually with flanges, that is meant to focus force into small areas. You didn't have to break through armor. You just had to hit it hard enough for the body underneath to file a complaint. The real new thing was flanges. Flanges didn't spread impact evenly like a smooth ball. Instead, they focused energy into narrow ridges. This meant more damage, more shock, and more regret with each swing. Armor got dented and bones broke. Internal organs found out that helmets weren't soundproof After all, the mace was especially appealing because it was simple. No need to sharpen an edge, chip a blade, or learn a complicated technique. You were already qualified if you could lift it and swing it. This efficiency was appreciated by armies in the Middle Ages. It took time to train. Panic didn't. The mace also had a strong effect on the mind. Getting hit by a sword hurt, but it often came with wounds that are easy to see. Getting hit with a mace. That left you standing there, confused, dizzy, and suddenly wondering why the world was spinning. Knights learned that being able to survive a mace hit didn't mean they were okay. It just meant that the damage was happening inside their very expensive armor, where they couldn't see it. Clerics even liked maces, which they thought were better because they didn't spill blood. This was true in the same way that dropping a piano on someone stops them from stabbing them. The end result was still very final. Of course, maces had some bad points. They were heavy, needed a lot of strength, and didn't look very good. Nobody ever looked at a mace and thought, ah, yes, beauty. But warfare in the Middle Ages wasn't about looks. It was about getting things done. The mace was a turning point. Armor didn't protect anymore. It was the packaging. The mace was the way to get it there. The mace was like medieval anger made solid. The warhammer was like anger that had gotten a master's degree. Weapon designers had already agreed that crushing worked better than cutting, and was better. The warhammer just made the idea better and made the message very clear. You made a bad choice when you bought armor. At first glance, the warhammer looks almost polite. It's smaller than a mace, not as wide, and not as dramatic. But this was not being nice. This was focus. One side of the head was usually flat and had a hammer face that was made to hit hard. The other side was usually a sharp spike or beak that could punch through armor, helmets, or joints like a medieval can opener. The smart. The warhammer was very accurate. You didn't have to swing wildly. You didn't need a lot of dramatic momentum. You needed to be right. A hard hit to the head could make you lose your train of thought right away. A hit to the shoulder could make the whole arm go numb. A well-placed spike could make someone feel invincible one minute and panic the next. People who wore armor quickly learned a hard lesson. Safety and protection were not the same thing. Plate armor spread out the force, but it didn't stop it. A warhammer didn't cut through metal. It sent energy right through it. The armor stayed in one piece. The person inside didn't. This made warhammers very popular for close combat. The warhammer was great when battles turned into chaotic scrums of shouting, slipping, and bad footing. It was small, quick, deadly, and unlike swords, it didn't get stuck or bounce off at the worst possible time. The spike made things worse. It hit weak spots like visors, armpits, joints, and anywhere else the armor had to bend. Knights trained for years to be able to move in armor, only to find out that a sharp beak could undo all that work in a second. The first dented helmet made people lose faith quickly. Warhammers also gave their users a mental edge. They looked like they had a purpose. You didn't accidentally carry this weapon. If someone came up to you with a warhammer, you knew exactly what they wanted, and it didn't involve talking. The warhammer was a turning point in medieval warfare when physics took over from tradition in many ways. No love, no ceremony, just power, momentum, and the fact that metal doesn't stop force. It just changes its direction. This was a hard truth for armored warriors to accept. It was a success story for the people who made Warhammer. At a certain point, soldiers in the Middle Ages all came to an important realization. It was up to you whether or not you were close to danger. You didn't really need to stand in front of a heavily armored, angry stranger to solve the problem. You could just keep them away from you and let them deal with it. And so, the polearm went up to prominence. In medieval warfare, pole arms were like long-handled multi-tools, halberds, glaives, bills, and spears. It had to have a long stick with something bad on the end. The idea behind the design was simple. Get the most people to see it and the least amount of regret. Just one spear changed everything. Foot soldiers could suddenly threaten knights before the knight's sword even came into play. A line of spears turned the infantry into a wall of no. The horses wouldn't charge. Armor turned into not useful if you couldn't get close enough to use it. Distance didn't mean cowardice. It was a plan that showed respect for oneself. Things got worse after that. Designers started adding blades, hooks, spikes, and edges to the spearhead. This made it possible for it to stab, slash, hook, and sometimes ruin a rider's whole afternoon. For example, the halberd had an axe blade, a spear point, and a hook because one way of causing trouble wasn't enough. Pole arms worked especially well against knights on horseback. Horses are brave, but they aren't dumb. A wall of sharp things pointing at your chest sends a very clear message. The knight stopped when the horse did. If the knight stopped, gravity would take over. Throughout the Middle Ages, gravity was always a reliable ally in battle. There was also a boost to morale. It was scary to face one sword. It was scary to see a dozen pole arms move in sync. Infantry units learned how to stay in formation, brace together, and move forward slowly. Individual acts of bravery were less important than pressure from a group. In the Middle Ages, war changed from being impressive to staying alive. Of course, polearms weren't very pretty. You didn't fight them. You didn't stand up like a hero. You stood in line, stayed calm, and trusted your neighbors not to freak out. It was less romantic and much more useful. In many ways, pole arms were a sign of maturity in medieval warfare. Less flash, more usefulness, and more awareness that distance lowers risk. Pole arms didn't promise fame. They promised to keep them alive. That was the most creative weapon of all in medieval times. The Becta Corbin shows that people who made weapons in the Middle Ages were still trying new things. They had just become more specific. The Warhammer made armor uncomfortable, but the Becta Corbin made it personal. This weapon was not meant for everyone. This was a fast, targeted complaint. The Becta Corbin looks like a warhammer that has chosen to focus on one thing. One side had a hammer face that could break armor. The other side ended in a long, curved spike called the crow's beak. Its purpose was to pierce, hook, and generally destroy the structural integrity of anything made of expensive metal. The Bia Corbin was great because it could be used in many ways. You could break things with it. It could stab you. If neither worked right away, you could hook your opponent and bring them to the ground, which was a perfectly acceptable way to end a fight in medieval times. Knights spent years learning how to stay on their horses, stay balanced, and act like gentlemen, only to be pulled off their horse like a sack of grain. The real targets were the armor joints: elbows, knees, visors, armpits, and all the other places armor had to bend to work. The crow's beak fit into these gaps with scary ease. All of a sudden, all that steel protection became a very costly trap that you couldn't get out of. The Becta Corbin was also very good at scaring people. It's really scary when someone comes up to you with a long pole with a hammer on one end and a curved spike on the other. It looked less like a weapon and more like a medieval book called How This Ends that taught people how to do things. Also, the Becta Corbin didn't need to be pretty like swords did. It took intention. You didn't use it to fence. You moved forward, picked a target, and used force until the problem was solved. Training was important, but being excited was even more so. This weapon worked best in the late Middle Ages, when plate armor was at its best. Knights were safe, sure of themselves, and getting more and more angry that people kept making tools that were meant to get around that protection. The Becta Corbin was the perfect example of that anger. In a lot of ways, it was the end of medieval warfare, pretending that armor was invincible. It wasn't about breaking the armor, it was about taking advantage of it. The Vector Corbin didn't fight with armor, it used leverage to negotiate and usually won. The crossbow would win the most controversial category for medieval weapons, not because it was especially flashy or it was elegant or honorable, but it worked a little too well and for the wrong people. It took years of training, physical strength, and a lot of bravery to kill a fully armored knight before the crossbow became popular. This system worked well for knights. It made sense for them to think they were better at violence because of their social status, their expensive gear, and their belief that they were naturally better at it. The crossbow came and quietly ruined everything. There was a simple problem with the crossbow. It took skill out of the equation. A peasant with little training could pick one up, point it in the right direction, and fire a bolt with enough force to break through armor, skin, or open joints. A mechanical trigger and bad intentions ruined generations of the martial tradition. The ruling classes were very angry about this. Crossbows were strong because they stored energy in a mechanical way. You didn't have to be very strong. Levers, cranks, or windlasses were used to pull the bowstring. The weapon waited patiently like it was holding a grudge. When it was let go, all that stored energy went straight into the bolt and then into someone's day. They were right on target, deadly, and scary. Knights called crossbows cowardly weapons, which in medieval times meant, "This is very bad for me." The church even tried to stop them from being used against Christians by saying they weren't fit for honorable warfare. Everyone who wanted to live right away ignored this statement. Crossbows changed on the battlefield. Actions. Knights stayed away from open ground. The shields got bigger. Armor designs changed. Pavis shields, which are big, portable walls, were made so that crossbowmen could reload without being shot themselves. The weapon changed the way wars were fought because it couldn't be ignored, and it had a huge effect on people's minds. You didn't see the crossbow bolt coming. There was no warning. You were sure of your armor for a while. The next thing you knew, you were on the ground wondering when things went wrong. Crossbows weren't very creative in how they looked. They were creative as a result. They leveled social hierarchies and made medieval warfare less about family ties and more about strategy, patience, and luck. The crossbow didn't care who you were. It didn't matter what you wore. It only cared if you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. That made it one of the most feared weapons in the Middle Ages. Not all weapons from the Middle Ages had to be big, loud, or impressive. Some of the best designs were small, quiet, and ran on spite alone. The cowrip is a small, spiked object that makes one simple promise. No matter how it lands, one spike will always be pointing up, ready to ruin someone's day. Cowrips were the best example of medieval minimalism. No moving parts, no need to learn, and no honor involved. You didn't swing them, aim them, or fight with them. You just dropped them on the ground and let physics and bad shoes take care of the rest. Rest. It was an inconvenience that had been turned into a weapon. Cowrips didn't just hurt soldiers, they hurted other people too. They were horses, and horses were the most important thing to medieval armies. A single cowrip under a hoof could kill an animal right away, turning a strong cavalry charge into a confused, screaming mess of stopped momentum and lost confidence. Knights might be able to live through injuries. Horses didn't often do that. Cowrips were a form of psychological warfare for infantry. It was hard to see them, you couldn't hear them, and when you knew they were there, every step turned into a negotiation. A few small metal things that could fit in a pouch caused the march to slow down, the lines to break, and panic to set in. The fact that cowrips worked so well made them even more cruel. They were cheap to make, easy to move, and could be used again if you were brave enough to get them back. Armies could keep the enemy from moving through whole areas without using swords. Someone had thrown things around, making roads, fields, and choke points dangerous, little spikes, and walked away with a smile. Cowrips also completely ignored armor. If you couldn't walk, plate protection didn't mean anything. Shields didn't help. Talent didn't matter. It didn't matter what rank you were. Everyone had feet. Everyone needed them. Medieval designers knew this very well and didn't think twice about using it. There wasn't any romance, drama, or heroic fighting in cowrips. Instead, there was just a sudden, sharp realization that the ground had turned against you. A lot of battles were put off, changed direction, or left behind because it was no longer safe to move forward. Cowrips are a strange way to show how honest medieval warfare was. No speeches, no ceremony, just a quiet recognition that sometimes the best way to win is to make it impossible for people to move. Cowrips didn't kill you right away. They just made sure you couldn't run when everything else tried to. and that was often worse in medieval wars. The Morning Star was the same idea as the mace, which was the most basic form of blunt force trauma in the Middle Ages. Someone said, but what if we added spikes for emphasis? The end result was a weapon that made getting hit with a mace not only painful, but also emotionally painful. The Morning Star looks like it could be a decoration at first glance. A metal ball with spikes on it that is attached to a handle, like a violent decoration. This is not true. The spikes weren't there for looks. They were there to make sure that even armor that survived the first hit still felt bad about it later. The reasoning was very simple. A smooth mace head spread force evenly, which was great for breaking bones, but sometimes armor worked too well. The Morning Star fixed this by focusing the impact into smaller, angrier points. It didn't spread the force, it focused it. Armor got more dense, the padding got harder. Whatever was underneath learned a valuable lesson about what happens when you do something. Morning Stars also had an advantage in terms of mental health. The brain does something when it sees spikes. A plain metal ball says, "This." A spiked one says, "This will hurt," and I had fun making it. Seeing a morning star was scary in a way that went beyond physics. It seemed like it was personal. Most morning stars were stiff, unlike flails. No chain, no chaos, and no surprise recoil. This made them safer for the user and easier to predict in formation fighting. You could swing with confidence because you knew the weapon wouldn't come back and ask for an apology. They were also strong. No sharp edges, no sharpening, and no other maintenance. Is it still heavy and full of spikes? If so, you were good to go. Medieval armies liked weapons that could take a lot of abuse, bad weather, and the occasional misuse by people who hadn't slept well in weeks. Morning stars found their place, especially in close combat, where there wasn't much room and a lot of panic. With one swing, you could knock your opponent off balance, break their armor, and lower their morale right away. The enemy didn't want to keep talking, even if they lived. The Morning Star was a symbol of medieval escalation in many ways. Maces did their job. So, someone asked how to make them worse. The answer was spikes, always spikes. The Morning Star was not subtle. It wasn't pretty. It was a reminder that medieval artists usually followed one rule. If it works, add spikes and try again. Handheld weapons were a way for people to be creative in the Middle Ages. Siege weapons were a way for people to be creative on a larger scale, but they needed math, teamwork, and a worrying lack of empathy. At some point, armies in the Middle Ages looked at fortified cities with thick walls, tall towers, and smug defenders, and they thought the best way to solve the problem was to throw buildings at buildings. Bring in the siege engines. Ballista, trebuchet, and mangonels were more than just weapons. They were words. They said, "We don't want to fight you. We just want your wall to go away." If that wall happened to be connected to a city, that was just an extra problem. The trebuchet was the best part of the show. Powered by gravity and a lot of patience, it could throw huge rocks over long distances with terrifying accuracy. It was like seeing physics lose its cool when you saw one work. Crews carefully changed the angles, counterweights, and release points so that one rock could fly through the air and politely knock down a piece of masonry. But stones were just the start. Medieval soldiers quickly learned that fear could go farther than rocks, so they sent out burning things, dead animals with diseases, and sometimes very loud messages in the form of whatever was laying around. A cow that is rotting and falls into your yard is a clear sign that you should give up. Ballists, which were basically big crossbows, shot bolts that were as big as tree trunks. These weren't meant for exact duels. They were meant to break down gates, towers, and morale all at once. Mangonels threw stones with less skill but more enthusiasm, showing that accuracy wasn't as important when the momentum was strong enough. Siege weapons changed the way wars were fought by moving the focus from individual bravery to the ability of industry to last. You didn't win just because you were good at it. You beat your enemy by outlasting, outsmarting, and outbuilding them. Sieges could last for weeks or even months, wearing down defenders mentally long before the walls fell. And this is where the real creativity starts. Most siege engines were made on the spot. Armies came with tools, wood, and instructions, then built huge weapons that people could see them making. Think about seeing your enemy put together a machine made just for the purpose of destroying your home. That's a lot of confidence for the Middle Ages. Siege warfare was not graceful. It was slow, painful, and very uncomfortable, but it did work. The walls broke, cities gave up, and engineers from the Middle Ages showed that sometimes the best weapon wasn't something you held in your hands. It changed the battlefield in a big way. Siege weapons didn't only attack walls, they went after hope. After hundreds of years of coming up with more and more creative ways to kill each other, finally, the soldiers from the Middle Ages stopped and asked a rare, deep question. What if we didn't die right away? The Pavy's shield was the answer. It was a piece of equipment that showed how medieval warfare briefly flirted with self-preservation. In the heroic sense, the pavesi wasn't a shield. You didn't pay for it. You didn't fight it. You didn't look good holding it. It was big and rectangle-shaped, and it looked like a wooden door that had been ripped off its hinges. But it worked, and that made it beautiful in a very useful way from the Middle Ages. The pavis was basically a portable wall made for crossbowmen. Soldiers put it in the ground, crouched behind it, and used it as cover while they reloaded. It took long enough for an enemy archer to finish praying, shoot an arrow, and think about changing jobs. It was a risk to reload without cover. It was possible to survive with a pavis. These shields were often tall enough to cover the whole body, and sometimes curved a little to deflect incoming. Missiles. A lot of them had symbols, city crests, or religious pictures on them because nothing says, "Please protect me," like a saint watching over your reload cycle. The pavis changed how people acted on the battlefield. Crossbow units got better at following orders, staying still, and killing. Instead of firing once and running away, they could stay where they were, reload safely, and keep the pressure on the enemies who were getting closer. This made knights very angry, which was often the point of medieval warfare. Of course, the pavis came with bad things. It was heavy, hard to carry, and not something you wanted to carry up a hill while arrows were flying around. The soldiers who had to carry pavises were like medieval interns, essential, undervalued, and always wondering how their decisions brought them here. The pavis, on the other hand, is a big change. Medieval warfare began to realize that survival was important. Armor wasn't the only way to protect yourself anymore. It was about where you stood, how well you worked with others, and how willing you were to hide behind a big piece of wood. The pav wasn't very fancy. It didn't make songs, but it saved lives, which was a big deal in medieval warfare. Things got worse quickly when medieval warfare found fire. Fire didn't care about armor, rank, training, or how sure you were of yourself. Fire just showed up and said that everyone's plans were off. It was the most fair weapon that armies used in the Middle Ages, and that's why they loved it. There were many types of fire weapons: flaming arrows, burning pitch, and pots of oil that were set on fire and thrown over walls. If it could, burned and could be thrown. Medieval armies tried it at least once, and sometimes twice, just to be sure. Not every goal was to destroy. A lot of the time, it was panic, and fire was very good at that. Flaming arrows weren't so much about hitting their target as they were about causing chaos. A single arrow hitting a thatched roof could turn a calm town into a maze of smoke and screams. All of a sudden, defenders weren't protecting walls. They were doing everything they could to keep their homes from disappearing behind them. Fire didn't have to kill you directly. It just needed to get you to give up your position. It was worse to burn pitch, thick, sticky, and unwilling to go out. Pitch stuck to wood, walls, and anything else that happened to be nearby. Once it was lit, it wouldn't go out easily. Water laughed at it. Sometimes sand helped. Panic only made it spread faster. Then there was Greek fire, which is famous. A strange weapon that burned even on water, scared enemies, and made sure that no one who faced it ever lived to tell the tale. Forgot about the event. People didn't want this used on them, so exact formulas were kept secret. Later on, guns worked best on people's minds. The night was lit up by flames. The air was full of smoke. The sound alone, crackling, roaring, and collapsing buildings, drained morale faster than any blade. The soldiers broke up. The leaders lost control. The noise made orders disappear. Fire also made sieges a living nightmare. Cities relied on wooden buildings, food stores, and the spirits of their people. A fire that is well placed could undo months of work in just a few minutes. The fear stayed even after the fire was put out. Defenders slept lightly, watching shadows move and wondering when the next fire would start. Fire was a favorite weapon in medieval warfare because it worked quickly. There was no need for accuracy. It didn't take courage. It just needed a chance and a strong wind. Fire didn't say anything. Fire didn't talk things over. Fire reminded everyone that the most creative weapon is sometimes the one that takes away all other options. Not every. Master blacksmiths made beautiful weapons, that were used in medieval battles. In fact, a lot of battles were fought with whatever was close at hand when things went wrong. This is where weapons that weren't planned came into play. Not invited, not controlled, and very excited. The plan didn't always work in medieval wars. People fell, weapons broke, horses got scared, and suddenly the battlefield turned into a chaotic flea market of sharp things, heavy things, and things that shouldn't have been involved in combat but were. Clubs were made from broken spears. Sword handles were used as punching tools. People used shields less to block and more to throw someone to the ground. People picked up rocks and threw them with a lot of emotion. People grabbed the edges of helmets and used them as handles. You could lift it, swing it, or drop it from above. You had a weapon, so congratulations. Farm tools were very popular because armies in the Middle Ages were often made up of farmers who had been using these things for years. Axes, scythes, pitchforks, and flails that were originally used for grain were all easily changed to be used in battle. The only thing that really changed was the intention. One minute you're picking crops, and the next you're picking enemies. Life in the Middle Ages moved quickly. Improvised weapons worked so well because they were unexpected. Armor was made to protect against known dangers: arrows, spears, and swords. It was much less ready to be hit with. A sharpened fence post or a wagon wheel. Chaos is good for people who can adapt, and improvisation did well in chaos. There was also a mental part to it. It was scary to face a trained knight with a shiny weapon. It was very scary to see a tired peasant swinging a random object with nothing to lose. That person wasn't following the rules. That person didn't care about survival rates. That person was a pain. Improvised weapons remind us that fighting in the Middle Ages wasn't just about tools. It was all about how you think. When structure fell apart, creativity stepped in to fill the void. There were no manuals, no permission, just the instinct to survive that turned into action. In a lot of battles, the most dangerous time wasn't when the troops charged or fought. After that, things got out of hand and people had to figure things out on their own. Weapons made on the spot weren't very nice. They weren't planned, but they worked out. That made them as medieval as anything made of steel. For all the steel and spikes, fire and smart engineering were important parts of medieval warfare, but there was one invisible fuel that was stronger than any weapon. Fear. Most weapons from the Middle Ages weren't made just to kill. They were made to scare people. If you could scare the enemy, the battle would end faster, cheaper, and with a lot less work. Even though they never said it in such a nice way, medieval commanders really understood this. Think about how chaotic a medieval battlefield looked. Men yelling, armor clanking, and horses screaming like they had just figured out what was going on. Weapons with spikes, chains that rattled, and banners that flapped around for no reason at all. Everything about the scene was meant to be too much for the senses. Fear wasn't an accident. It was put together. A lot of weapons were made to look scary on purpose. Spikes were useless once someone was dead, but they were great at making people think twice about moving forward. Chains made sounds. Panic meant noise. Fire lit up the night sky, turning the dark into a flickering, bad dream. Siege engines loomed in the distance, silently promising that homes, walls, and hope were all temporary. Even sound could be used as a weapon. Drums make beats that are meant to make you feel uneasy. Horns honked without warning. The sound of an army charging wasn't just noise, it was psychological pressure that came in waves. Your body reacted before your brain could think about it. Fear also spread more quickly than facts. If one unit breaks ranks, the whole army could fall apart. You didn't have to kill everyone. You just had to make them believe they were already losing. Brutal looking weapons from the Middle Ages sped up that process. If someone nearby fell and screamed after seeing a flail, morning star, or burning pitch, everyone else paid attention. Fear didn't go away when you wore armor. Fear didn't go away after training. Veterans knew exactly what those weapons could do, which made things worse at times. When imagination filled in the blanks, confidence fell apart quickly. Fear stayed even after the battles were over. Survivors brought home memories, scars, and stories. Stories about scary weapons spread faster than armies ever could, which meant that future enemies were already on edge when they got there. In medieval wars, killing was often not the main goal. Winning meant having power. Breaking morale gave them control. When fear took over, morale fell apart. Cut steel bodies, fire burned down buildings, but fear broke apart armies from the inside. And weapon makers in the Middle Ages, whether they wanted to or not, knew exactly what they were doing. When you take away the armor, the banners, the spikes, and the strange love of fire, and you'll see that all medieval weapons have the same purpose: to stay alive, not for glory or cruelty, for its own sake. Living in a world where losing meant death, poverty, or watching everything you owned burn behind a stone wall, people who made medieval weapons weren't trying to be creative in an artistic way. It was necessary. Weapons changed as armor got better. The walls got taller, so the stones flew farther. Shields stopped blades, so chains were wrapped around them. Every new idea was a response, not a dream. Someone had a problem, barely made it through, and then went home thinking that it couldn't happen again. And so the cycle went on. It's not just how brutal medieval weapons were that makes them so interesting. It's also how useful they were. There was no wasted work, no unnecessary decorations. There was a spike, hook, flange, or awkward angle for every problem someone had to deal with in. Fight. Engineers in the Middle Ages didn't care about impressing people who would visit museums in the future. They were trying to make sure that tomorrow would still be there. This creativity is also very human in some ways. People made do with what they had when they didn't have much. Tools for farming turned into weapons. Building methods turned into siege engines. Physics became a reliable friend. Fear itself was used as a weapon because people knew that it was often easier to break someone's spirit than to break their body. And even though it was brutal, there was smartness here, planning, watching, and trying again. The students in medieval warfare learned quickly because it was a tough classroom. Every mistake became information. Every survival was a test of the idea. It's easy to think that medieval weapons were rough or barbaric when compared to today's technology. But in reality, they were very smart answers to the problems of their time. People who knew about materials, force, leverage, and human psychology built them long before those ideas were even thought of. Had neat scientific names. Medieval weapons that were creative weren't meant to be cruel. They were about being flexible, not giving up, and using the tools at hand to solve problems, even if the solution didn't look good. In the end, swords and spikes didn't define medieval warfare. It was characterized by creativity in stressful situations. And that was what really made these weapons medieval. Theodora was born in Constantinople around the year 500, not in marble halls or silk draped rooms, but into the loud, unstable, and unforgiving edges of Byzantine society. Her father was a bearer for the Hippodrome, a huge arena where chariot racing, factional violence, and imperial politics all came together. It was a dangerous job that didn't pay well and depended on the public's support. Theodora's family had a hard time right away when he died while she was still a child. In Byzantium, social status was passed down from one generation to the next. If a family didn't have a male protector, they could lose their social status almost overnight. From Theodora learned at a young age that being able to change was important for survival. Her upbringing didn't give her any false sense of innocence. The city around her was both beautiful and cruel, and it rewarded intelligence much more than good behavior. She started acting as a teenager. She was an actress who officially played funny and serious roles for the public. Byzantine moral codes really saw actresses as morally suspect at best and openly dishonorable at worst. Law and custom put them in the same group as prostitutes, taking away their respect, legal protection, and any chance of marrying into the elite. But the stage gave Theodora something that most women like her never had: an audience. She learned how to get people's attention, read their emotions, and change their expectations by performing in front of crowds. She learned when to make people laugh, when to make them uncomfortable, and when to be quiet just long enough to take over a room. These were more than just tricks for the stage. They were the first signs of political skill. Later, hostile contemporary sources blew her performances out of proportion, turning them into scandal and painting her youth as immoral and depraved. The truth behind the gossip is more important than the gossip itself. She lived in a society where women of her class had few options. Theodora didn't give in to that stress. She saw it, learned from it, and put up with it. By the time she left Constantinople in her early 20s and traveled through the eastern provinces of the empire, she was no longer just a person who performs. She was a tough woman who had grown up in poverty, knew how to persuade people, and knew exactly how power worked. Theodora knew about crowds, fear, and authority long before she ever wore a crown. The lessons learned by people at the bottom of society would later change the course of an empire. Theodora left Constantinople and disappeared from the brutal spotlight of the capital. She then went on a journey that would quietly change her life. She went east across the Byzantine world and finally made it to North Africa, where she lived for a few years, away from the crowds at the Hippodrome and their cruel ease. This was not a happy exile. It was a retreat because they were tired, disappointed, and knew they couldn't survive by performing alone. Theodora lived without an audience for the first time. In these provinces, she met people who were very different from the cynical, flashy people in the capital. Here, religious arguments were very important, especially the growing split within Christianity. Theodora became very close to. Monophysite believers were part of a religious movement that the imperial government thought was wrong, but it was very popular among the poor and outcasts. This wasn't just a change in spirit, it was learning about politics. Theodora saw firsthand how doctrine could split people apart, justify persecution, and make people more loyal than blood or law. She lived a simple life during this time. Sources say she lived simply and made a living by doing textile work instead of performing. The change is clear, whether it is completely true or shaped by later admiration. Theodora was no longer known for her looks. She was changing who she was. She was no longer ashamed of being poor. It taught her a lesson. She was not the same woman when she came back to Constantinople as she had been when she left. The reckless performer who was known for public scandals was no longer there. Someone who was calm, observant, and very serious stood in her place. She now saw suffering not as an idea, but as something that happened in real life. That. Later on, her understanding would make her more sympathetic to women, the poor, and religious minorities. Around this time, she met Justinian, who was then a rising political figure and the emperor's nephew. There was no romantic destiny in their meeting. It was a coming together of strategies. Justin saw intelligence, charm, and determination in Theodora, even though she had a troubled past. She saw ambition that was close to power. Both of them knew that the other was useful, dangerous, and rare. Their relationship faced immediate opposition. It was against the law for high-ranking officials to marry actresses. Instead of leaving her, Justinian changed the law itself. This was the first sign that Theodora had power. Her life had already shown one thing for sure, even before she put on the imperial crown. She couldn't be erased, quieted down, or kept inside. She had learned how to live in the shadows, and now she was ready to go back to the center of power on her own terms. When Justinian became emperor in the year 527, Theodora became his partner in ruling, not just a pretty face. As soon as she became Augusta, it was clear that this was not a normal imperial marriage. Theodora didn't stay inside the palace, happy with ceremonies and titles. She went to councils, met with foreign diplomats, and got directly involved in issues of law, religion, and security. Many of the powerful people in the Byzantine Empire found her presence unsettling. It was one thing for an empress to have a voice, an empress who thought people should do what she said was. One more. Her past made her the perfect person to be in charge. Theodora knew what it was like to be afraid, hungry, and publicly humiliated, unlike aristocrats who grew up in comfort. She knew that crowds could get violent quickly, and that authority could fall apart if it looked weak. This realism affected how she thought about politics. She preferred loyalty to tradition and decisive action to compromise. People who didn't think much of her did so for a short time. Theodora quickly became a defender of women and other groups that were not well represented. She pushed for laws that punished sexual exploitation, gave women more rights to property, and gave former prostitutes legal protection and a chance to start over. These changes were not just about morality, they were about them. Theodora made laws from memory, changing them so that others wouldn't have to go through what she did. Her religious influence was just as important. Even though she officially supported imperial orthodoxy, she quietly supported monophysite Christians by giving their leaders a place to stay in the palace and using imperial authority to stop persecution. Power to lessen persecution. This balancing act needed a lot of political skill. Theodora was able to protect religious minorities without directly going against imperial doctrine. This showed that she understood power not as a weapon, but as pressure applied at the right time. Later, historians in the court had a hard time putting her in a box. Some people said she was cruel, while others said she was holy. They both missed the point. Theodora was practical. She thought that the empire stayed alive because of its strength, discipline, and planned mercy, not longing for the past. She didn't have time for elites who thought that being from a certain family made you better at something. By the time Justinian had been in power for a few years, it was clear that two people were in charge of the empire, not one. Theodora was not an exception to Byzantine politics. She was its growth. She didn't get her power from being born into it or being in charge of the military. Instead, she had an unshakable understanding of how people act that made her both dangerous and necessary. In 532, things went crazy in Constantinople. Factional violence between rival chariot teams started a full-blown rebellion. The city burned as mobs took over the streets, killed officials, and named a new emperor. This was the Na Revolt, which was the most dangerous uprising during Justinian's time. For a few days, it looked like his life and rule were over. As flames destroyed churches and palaces, fear spread through the imperial court. Advisors told Justinian to leave the capital and go to another place to regroup. Ships for escaping were ready. They said that survival was better than dying for one's beliefs. Authority wavered in that moment of fear. The empire was about to fall apart. Theodora was the one who wouldn't give in. Later stories say that she stood in front of the council and spoke words that became famous. She said that royalty was a noble burial shroud. To run away was to live in shame. It was better to die as an empress than to live without power. This was not a proud speech. It was clear what the politics were. Theodora knew something that her worried advisors didn't. Once N. He stops being emperor when he runs. Retreat would not help Justinian. It would kill him. Her determination made her choose. Justinian stayed. What happened next was brutal and final. Imperial troops closed off the Hippodromiome, where the rebels had gathered, thinking they had won. Then the army attacked. In one day, tens of thousands were killed. The end of the revolt was not through negotiation, but through death. The throne was safe, but the city was damaged. Theodora's role in this moment changed how power was seen in the empire forever. Seen in the empire. She hadn't led troops, but she had made the decision that would decide the outcome. Her bravery wasn't foolish. It was planned. She knew that fear spreads faster than fire, and that power stays strong only when it doesn't back down. Her power only grew stronger after the revolt. People in charge who had been unsure were pushed aside. Loyalty was the only thing that kept people alive. The monuments, churches, and laws in Constantinople that were rebuilt came from ashes that Theodora's iron will shaped. The Oz revolt showed who she really was. Not only was she as smart as Justinian, in times of trouble, she was his rock. Theodora saw the narrow path to total control where others saw destruction, and she walked it without thinking twice. After the Na revolt, which stabilized the empire, Theodora turned her attention to something less exciting but much more lasting: the law. Justinian is known as the great codifier of Roman law, but the changes that happened during his time were not made by lawyers alone. Behind. Theodora made some of the most radical changes, writing laws with the clarity of someone who had lived in the system's most difficult blind spots. Theodora fought hard for women's legal rights, especially for those who society wanted to forget. She fought for laws that made forced prostitution a crime and punished men who took advantage of women who were weak. For the first time, rape was seen as a serious crime, no matter what the victim's social status was. Changes were made to divorce laws to give women more. Wives were no longer legally invisible in marriage because their property and agency rights were expanded. These were not empty gestures. They changed the lives of thousands of people every day. One of the most telling things she did was build safe houses for former prostitutes, which were state-supported places where women could live without being forced back into prostitution. Critics made fun of these efforts, calling them sentimental or hypocritical, pointing to her past. Theodora didn't pay any attention to them. She knew that moral authority didn't come from, not purity, but determination. Her changes were clearly interventionist. She thought the government should stop abuse, not let it happen. Her influence went beyond just gender. Theodora always said that we should be kind to the poor and not hurt religious minorities. She didn't see persecution as a sign of strength. She saw it as a sign of bad management. When dissent was brutally suppressed, it created martyrs. It dissolved when it was handled with care. This way of thinking quietly influenced imperial policy, even when it went against the instincts of military leaders and bishops. The aristocracy was not only upset by the reforms themselves, but also by where they came from. Law has always come from the top down, from powerful men who were trained in rhetoric and lineage. Now it was being changed by a woman who had power because of her experience instead of her family background. Theodora didn't argue with theory. She made a case for consequences. She changed the moral structure of Byzantium by making compassion a part of imperial law. The empire didn't get softer, but it did get more controlled, more planned, and less cruel for no reason. These laws stayed in place long after the fires were put out and the rebellions were over. Theodora knew something that few other rulers do. Violence gets you power quickly, but the law does it quietly. And in her own way, she quietly rewrote the empire. As Justinian's rule went on, the empire faced a quieter, but just as dangerous threat: religious division. Doctrinal conflict tore families apart, caused riots, and weakened loyalty in cities and villages. To the throne. Official policy made Caledonian Orthodoxy the only religion, but many people, especially in Egypt and Syria, stayed true to Monophysite Christianity. If they were crushed, there was a risk of rebellion. Allowing them to be open about it could have led to accusations of weakness. Theodora decided to handle this problem herself. Theodora was sympathetic to the Monophysite cause, but she wasn't reckless. She never tried to change the official doctrine. Instead, she worked from the shadows, keeping people safe instead of. Declaration: Monophysite bishops were secretly kept in palace compounds so they couldn't be arrested. They were questioned in private instead of being publicly humiliated, and they were quietly allowed to keep networks of influence. Theodora made the imperial court an unofficial place of refuge. This method had two goals. It calmed things down in the provinces while still making Justinian look like a religious leader. The emperor ruled by decree, but Theodora ruled by access. She made a choice: who was heard, who was spared, and who was quietly silenced. In an empire where politics and religion were closely linked, this made her one of the most powerful people in the world. Not everyone was happy. The Orthodox clergy didn't like it when she got involved, and people in the court whispered that she was hurting the empire's spiritual unity. Instead of fighting back, Theodora was patient. She knew that you couldn't force someone to believe something. To keep things stable, people needed to be tolerant while pretending to be strict. Her policies showed how she saw the world in general. Theodora didn't think that everyone should be the same. She believed in keeping things in check. As long as they didn't threaten the throne, there could be differences. She thought that violence was a sign that the government had failed higher up. Even Justinian, who cared a lot about theological legacy, listened to her more than most sources say he did. When things were about to get out of hand, it was usually Theodora who told people to hold off, wait, or find a quiet way to work things out. She had learned a long time ago that people who push too hard will eventually push back even harder. Theodora kept the empire from falling apart by treating belief as a political force instead of a moral battlefield. She really believed in God, but she always put stability first. That difference meant life or death in Byzantium. This part of her rule shows her most hidden strength. Theodora didn't need to win in public. She was happy to shape events without anyone knowing it, sure that history would go in the right direction. She made, even if it never said her name out loud. By the end of Justinian's reign, the way power worked in Byzantium had changed without anyone noticing. The emperor was still the center of the court, but the important people knew an unspoken truth. Theodora also had a clear path to power. Whether someone got a job, a petition, or even just lived depended on whether they were in her good graces or her bad graces. She didn't need proclamations to be in charge. It was enough to have an impact. People were afraid of Theodora not because she was not only unpredictable, but also consistent. She didn't show any emotion when she rewarded loyalty, and she didn't hesitate to punish betrayal. People in charge who thought she was weak because she was quiet didn't make the same mistake twice. She didn't like cruel plays, but she didn't mind being harsh when it was necessary for stability. She thought of mercy as a tool, not a reflex. During these years, she and Justinian were very dependent on each other. Justinian was still the visionary, builder of monuments, and codifier of law, dreamer of bringing back the Roman Empire. Theodora was the one who saw things as they really were. She kept his goals in check, kept him from acting on his impulses, and took the political hit for unpopular choices. He thought in terms of centuries, but she thought in terms of what would happen. During this time, illness started to affect her life, probably cancer, though sources from the time don't say for sure. Her authority did not go down even though her health did. She kept getting officials from her chambers, giving orders, and keeping an eye on court rivalries, with sharpness that doesn't go away. Being physically weak didn't mean giving up politically. If anything, her judgment got colder and sharper. Most people were troubled by the fact that she wouldn't make herself into a myth. Theodora did not try to get people to love her or make herself look better. She let her enemies hate her openly because she was sure that fear would last longer than love. She lived in a world where people cared a lot about status and looks, but she didn't have many illusions. Power was not holy. It was useful. Foreign diplomats paid attention. Even when negotiating with the emperor himself, Theodora's preferences were becoming more and more important in diplomacy. This had never happened before. An empress was no longer just a pretty face. She was a fixed variable in imperial calculations. Her legacy grew as her life got smaller. Theodora had shown that experience, not family ties, could give someone power, and intelligence, not tradition, could give someone power. She didn't take down the empire's buildings. She learned them all. In doing so, she set a dangerous example. That power could go to people who are brave enough to take it and disciplined enough to keep it. Theodora died in 548 after a long illness, probably cancer. She was still in her 40s. There were no dramatic last words written down, and there was no planned goodbye to the court. She liked to use her power quietly, without making a big deal out of it. But her absence was felt right away and caused problems. Byzantium had lost more than just an empress, but its most intelligent political mind. Justinian lived for almost 20 years after her death, but his reign was never the same. He kept making laws, building things, and dreaming of restoring the empire. But something important was gone. Theodora's realism made her advisors more open with her. The policy on religion got stricter. Military goals went beyond what resources could support. The balance she had kept between mercy and force, faith and control slowly fell apart. Modern. People's reactions to her death showed how much she had split opinions. Supporters mourned a ruler who understood suffering because she had been through it herself and protected the weak. Critics let out a sigh of relief, calling her manipulative, cruel, and dangerously ambitious. Many accounts written after her death, especially by people who didn't like her, turned her life into a scandal and an excess, turning decades of rule into moral judgment. It was easier to judge her past than to deal with her skills. But the law remembers what? Gossip doesn't remember. The changes she pushed for stayed in place. Women's rights stayed strong. Restrictions on exploitation persisted. Even after her personal networks were gone, her quiet acceptance of religious minorities left behind institutional traces. The empire kept going within a framework she had helped create, even though it acted like she was just a temporary problem. Theodora's legacy was hard to deal with because it messed up the order of the story. She wasn't born into nobility, but she ruled over nobles. She didn't get any training as a scholar who made the law. She wasn't a general, but she made decisions about battles. Byzantium liked to show off its power in a traditional way. Theodora showed that power is something you learn, not something you get from your parents. After she died, the court tried to go back to the way things were before, but past decisions can't be changed. People would compare future empresses to her, even if they didn't say so. She had made more things possible. Theodora did not leave behind only monuments with her name on them. She gave a warning and a model. An empire may endure brilliance devoid of kindness or kindness without strength. But under her rule, Byzantium learned what happens when both are in the same person. Theodora would not stay quiet in history long after she died. She stayed in the law books, the memories of the courts, and the worries of the empire, an unresolved presence that Byzantium never fully came to terms with. It was hard for chroniclers to fit her into familiar groups. She was too cruel to be a saint, too protective of the weak to be a tyrant, and too good at what she did to be ignored. A scandal. Instead, they fought about her. That argument was what she lived for after she died. Writers who didn't like her religious beliefs or were worried about her background relied heavily on her early years. They made survival a sin and ambition a crime. This was not a mistake. It was safer to attack her morals than her skills. People attacked Theodora where power wasn't supposed to be because she had ruled too well to be ignored. In a woman who had worked her way up from nothing. But even her enemies couldn't get rid of the proof of her rule. The decisions she made had an effect on the Byzantine state that came after her death. Women kept protections they had never had before. The poor had examples of when the empire stepped in. Religious minorities remembered that there had once been restraint at the highest level, and emperors learned quietly that unchecked ambition without internal balance could ruin a reign. Theodora's real legacy wasn't just one change or brave act. It was a new way to be in charge. She showed that you don't need to be born into a noble family, be in charge of an army, or be loved by the public to have power. It took knowing how people think, how they obey, and how they break. She didn't rule by illusion, but by accuracy. She looks like she's frozen in gold and mosaics, dressed in royal splendor, far away and out of reach. But hunger, shame, and strength made the real Theodora who she was. She took those memories with her to the palace and never forgot them. That memory made her a threat to those who, governed by habit, and essential for those who governed by necessity. Byzantium outlasted many emperors. A small number changed its internal logic. Theodora did, who changed what was possible within power itself. Her life is still unsettling because it doesn't give her any comfort. There is no redemption arc that ends in softness, and there is no punishment that brings back moral order. There is only skill that gets better when you have to work hard without aiding excuses. And that's why Theodora will always be around, more than any scandal or legend. Europe was already tired of failure of the crusade. Christians still couldn't control Jerusalem. The knights had marched east and come back broken, and faith was more angry than happy. A lot of people thought God was angry with warriors who were greedy and violent. If armed men had failed, maybe innocence would win. One of the strangest ideas in medieval history took root in this environment, that children who were free of sin could get the Holy Land back just by believing. The movement didn't start in palaces or monasteries. It started in villages. In northern France, a shepherd boy named Stephen of Clayses said that Christ had come to him as a poor pilgrim. Stephen says that he got a letter for the King of France and a command from God: bring the kids together and take them to Jerusalem. The news spread quickly. People didn't doubt things very often in a society where visions were taken seriously and miracles were expected. The story was very interesting. God had chosen the lowly. The young were chosen by God. Kids started to show up. Even though children is wrong, a lot of them were. Teenagers, some were young adults, while others were the poorest people in society, no matter how old they were. They didn't have any weapons, supplies, or plans that made sense. They sang hymns as they walked, sure that the Mediterranean would split in front of them like the Red Sea had done before. Parents tried to step in. Local priests often couldn't stop them. Some people even supported the movement, seeing it as a sign of God's renewal. The church did not approve of this crusade. There was no pope who called it, no bishops set up. That lack of official control was exactly what made it spread so quickly. Rumors, sermons, and feelings kept the movement going. Hunger, disease, and social inequality had already made communities less stable. The Children's Crusade gave suffering a purpose. It gave people who didn't have one a role. In medieval Europe, faith and reality were not separate. If God wanted to work through kids, then logistics didn't matter. Miracles would fill in the blanks. That belief wasn't foolish for the time. It was normal. The Children's Crusade was really dangerous because they were sincere, not fanatical. These young pilgrims had complete faith. They put their faith in people they didn't know. They believed in visions, They believed that faith would change the world, and because they had so much faith, they moved forward without fear. By the time the police figured out what was going on, the movement was already out of control. There were thousands of people on the road. The dream had taken hold, and once dreams are out, they are very hard to stop. As the movement grew beyond, in France, a similar procession began to form to the east of the Rhine. In Germany, a boy named Nicholas of Cologne became a prophet, saying that God had chosen the young to do what armored knights had failed to do. Nicholas promised miracles. Just like Stephen, he said that angels would help the faithful and that the sea would open up for them. This message was too good to pass up for thousands of families in need. Soon, roads were full of kids and teens leaving their villages. Some left at night without anyone knowing. Some people left openly, singing hymns and carrying crude crosses. Some of them weren't really young. A lot of them were poor workers, shepherds, beggars, and runaways who blended in with the crowds. Later, medieval chroniclers used the word children more to talk about social status than age. These were the weak, the ignored, and the disposable, but now they are all together in faith. The march itself was very hard. The roads were hot in the summer, food was hard to come by, and disease spread quickly among the crowds. There was no central, no power, no supply lines, and no safety. People who fell behind were left behind. Some died quietly in ditches. Some people turned back in shame and went home to villages that no longer knew them. But a lot of people kept going because they were all moving in the same direction. Stopping walking felt like not trusting God. As the columns moved south through the Alps, reality hit them harder. Mountain passes were harsh. Kids fell down from being too tired. Sometimes, out of pity or faith, locals would offer food or shelter. Others saw a chance. Thieves took advantage of the marchers. Guides who weren't honest asked for money to lead them on. There was no way for the crusade to protect itself from being taken advantage of. The clergy had different reactions. Some priests said that this was crazy, not holy. Some people were afraid to go against what they thought was God's will. In a world where miracles were common, not acting could look like disbelief. That pause cost him his life. The movement was never officially blessed, but it was also never clearly condemned. Being quiet became okay. The community, not leadership, was the most powerful force behind the march. Every child looked to the others for support. Belief must be right if everyone believed it. Doubt turned into loneliness. Faith turned into survival. By the time the Germans and French got to the Mediterranean coast, thousands of people had already died, deserted, or quietly fallen apart. But the people who stayed thought they were the chosen ones. They had been through a lot of pain, and they thought that pain showed that God was on their side. They were wrong, but they still didn't know how wrong they were. By the end of summer, the remaining groups had made it to the Mediterranean, sure that the last miracle was about to happen. The French followers of Stephen were going to Marseille. Nicholas led the German marchers to Genoa. This was the time when history would change in their minds. They would walk dry into the Holy Land, just like Moses did when he crossed the Red Sea. There would be a reason for all pain. All doubt would go away. The sea didn't open. The kids waited in Genoa. They prayed, sang, and looked at the water. God planned for some things to take longer. Confusion set in when nothing happened. Some people in the area made fun of them. Some people pied them. The city government told the pilgrims to leave because they were worried about the growing number of hungry people. Some of the kids agreed to work or stay with someone. Many people just sat on the shore, refusing to give up their faith even as it fell apart around them. Nicholas told his followers to keep going, saying that the miracle would happen somewhere else. A smaller group kept going south toward Rome. Along the way, they lost even more people to hunger and sickness. The Pope did not bless their mission when they finally got to him. Instead, he told them to go home and praise their faith. It was a soft rejection, but it hurt a lot. People didn't want to admit it, but the crusade was over. Things got worse in Marseille. Two merchants said they would take the kids across the sea for free. To tired pilgrims, this looked like a sign from God. People boarded ships and sang hymns, were sung, and hope rose one last time. Then the ships left and never came back, as they had said they would. We put together what happened next from bits and pieces and later testimony. Some ships sank in storms, killing everyone on board. Others made it to ports in North Africa, where they sold the kids into slavery. They trusted because of their faith. They were easy to betray because they trusted them. The Children's Crusade was a tragedy, not only because of what happened, but also because it was so likely to happen. Once belief took the place of structure, anyone could say. Power. When people thought miracles would happen, lies spread quickly. Enemies did not win against the children in the Holy Land. The world they went through broke them, standing on the beach, watching the sea stay the same. A lot of people must have felt something break inside them. Not just hope, but the knowledge that God was watching closely. That quiet, terrible realization was the real end of the crusade. After the sea didn't open and the promised way through turned out to be a lie, the Children's Crusade didn't end well. It fell apart. The people who made it to the coast spread out across Europe, carrying stories that were too painful and confusing to tell. There was no official announcement of failure, no accounting, and no attempt to save anyone. The movement just stopped and became quiet. The children who were taken from Marseille to ships had no idea what was going to happen to them. Later, chroniclers write about how they were taken to Muslim ports in North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, where they were sold as slaves. The pattern is more important than whether every detail is correct. Kids went missing, and no serious effort was made to find them. They didn't mean anything politically. No soldiers came after. There were no negotiations for ransoms. Once they were gone, they were gone. People who stayed behind didn't do much better. A lot of people were stuck in foreign cities with no money and no way to get home. Some were taken in by monasteries or families and quietly became part of new lives. Some people went hungry. Some went back home, but their parents turned them away. Couldn't figure out why they had left or what they had thought. The crusade didn't make them heroes, it made them a burden. The church leaders were careful in their response. Everyone wanted to avoid responsibility. The movement had never been officially approved, so it was safer to condemn it than to hold it accountable. Innocent III, the Pope at the time, is said to have praised the children's faith, but said that they should not be crusaders. It was a careful statement, showing respect without having to do anything. The institution kept its power by keeping itself away from the effects. What happened next was a historical unease. Chroniclers disagreed on the numbers, the leaders, and even whether the crusade really happened the way it was told. Some writers later said it was blown out of proportion, symbolic, or not understood. Others said it was real, but they didn't tell the whole story. This mix-up wasn't on purpose. It was easier to blur the lines of the children's crusade than to face them. It revealed uncomfortable truths about medieval society, such as how easily belief could be turned into a weapon and how little protection existed for the weak, and how quickly moral zeal could make up for carelessness. The kids thought they had been picked. Instead, they were left alone, maybe not by God, but by every system that was supposed to keep them safe. Faith had pushed them on. At the end, there was silence. Not only did children suffer in the children's crusade, but it was also sad. It is that their pain did not lead to any changes, apologies, or lessons learned. History took them in quietly, like it does with people who have no power. They marched because they thought the world would change for them. They didn't go away, they just disappeared into it. People started arguing about what really happened almost right after the children's crusade ended. Chroniclers from the Middle Ages had a hard time writing about the event without going against their own moral code. A large group of people who were driven by faith had not ended up in a miracle, but in neglect and exploitation. That was a risky area. The story broke apart. Some reports said that the march was real and huge, with tens of thousands of kids taking part. Some people said it was just a few misguided kids who were led astray by rumors. Some authors changed the meaning of the word children from young people to poor or socially dependent people. This lack of clarity made it easier for later generations to make the horror less scary. It didn't seem as bad if they weren't really kids. Modern historians are still arguing about the details. It's likely that the numbers were too high. The stories about leadership are probably not true, but doubt doesn't change the basic truth. Many young people, many vulnerable people, traveled long distances because of their faith, and many never came back. It didn't matter if the movement had thousands or hundreds of people. The people who disappeared were really affected by it. The confusion surrounding the children's crusade shows how history protects institutions. A clear story would make people accountable. A blurry one lets you get away. No one person could be blamed. There was no need for a formal apology. The event became a part of folklore, a sermon illustration, and a warning story instead of a political failure. The crusade became a symbol over time. Preachers used it to warn people not to be too fanatical. Moralists used it to talk about how the world can ruin innocent faith. Later, romantic writers changed it to tragic purity betrayed by cynical adults. Each retelling changed the event to fit the needs of the time. The kids themselves were lost in the interpretation. It's interesting how little the movement changed the rules. There were no changes to the way pilgrims did things, and there were no serious effort to control charismatic preaching among the poor, and no protections for the young. The lesson learned was not to protect the weak, but to not talk about this too clearly. The Children's Crusade is hard to place because it shows a fault line in medieval Christianity. Faith was meant to save. It was dangerous here. Obedience was meant to keep people safe. This is it. The crusade posed an unspoken question that many were reluctant to address. What happens when faith comes before duty? That question was quietly put to rest. People remember the Children's Crusade not because it changed the world, but because it failed so badly. It serves as a reminder that being honest doesn't stop tragedy, and that being devoted when you're not careful can be used against the people who are most devoted to you. The Children's Crusade was possible because of both their faith and the way people in the Middle Ages thought about innocence. People thought that children were closer to God because they weren't sinful or greedy. This thought was strong and risky. It let adults put their hopes on the young without having to take care of their safety. Innocence became a reason instead of a shield. Many grown-ups didn't stop the kids because they thought it would be against God's will. If kids were picked, there was doubt about interference. In a culture that was very religious, having doubts was a moral failure. Parents were unsure, priests were unsure, officials were unsure. Every delay helped the movement grow. What should have set off alarm instead? Inspired Oriwi. At the same time, the kids' innocence made them easy to take advantage of. They trusted people too easily. They thought that authority was kind. They thought that grown-ups wouldn't lie to them about something important. That trust was used to trick them. Guides made money. Merchants provided transportation. People you don't know promised miracles. Few were punished after that because the victims couldn't speak up or get help. The crusade also showed a harsh truth about society. Children who were poor mattered less. A lot of the people who joined were already on the edge, hungry, without a home, or not wanted. The power structures stayed stable even after they disappeared. No noble families were asking for answers. There were no economic effects, and there was no political pressure. People at the bottom of society quietly took the loss. The Children's Crusade acted as a moral blind spot in this way. Everyone who was involved could say they had good intentions. No one had to feel guilty. Faith made sense of everything. Tragedy turned into bad luck instead of failure. The language used around the event made this stronger.